Yes, I'm Graham Gudgin. I'm a retired economist. Still have an affiliation with the Centre for Business Studies at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. I'm also a member of the Department of International Trade's Expert Committee on Modelling Free Trade Agreements.
My name is Julian Jessop. I'm an independent economist with more than 30 years of professional experience gained in the public sector, in the city and consultancy. Most recently, I was the chief economist at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm still an economics fellow there. But I'm speaking today in an independent capacity as a Brexit supporter and an optimist about the impact on the UK economy. Basically, the modelers have tended to assume that there's going to be a very large increase in the cost of doing business with the European Union, and also that that cost itself has huge knock-on effects, not just in terms of the impact on trade volumes, but in other ways as well, including through very big negative impact on productivity. On top of that, they've made some other very strange assumptions. For example, that the government would adopt and also retain a policy on immigration that would be economically damaging pretty much for the foreseeable future. Now, of course, there are risks in all of these parts of the jigsaw. I mean, it is likely that trade frictions with the EU will be a little bit higher. It's possible there'll be some small negative impact on volumes of trade, and restrictions in the free flow of people and capital. They're usually bad for growth. But what other modelers seem to have done is made the most extreme possible assumptions on this, and frankly, assumptions that defy all sense of common sense or reality, just implausibly large numbers that are very hard to back up with any hard data from the real world.
Yes, my colleagues at Cambridge and Ulster University in Northern Ireland were the only group, I think, to completely replicate the Treasury's long-term forecasts, long-term predictions on the impact of Brexit, which they did prior to the referendum in 2016. When we looked at that, we found two big mistakes, really. One was that their method was to try and estimate how much trade the UK had gained by being a member of the EU, then assumed that in the case of no deal, they would lose all that advantage. And then, as Julian has just said, then doubled the impact of that by assuming there was a big knock-on effect, big link between trade and productivity, i.e., if you lose trade, then productivity goes down as well. But when we looked at that, the first big mistake was in estimating the gains to the UK in trade from being an EU member. And what they did there was they took the average gain across all 28 countries. And when we looked at the UK specifically, it was much less. It was less than a half of that figure. And the reason for that is that the UK, other than tiny Malta, is the only EU country which does more of its trade outside the EU than inside. Some countries do 80 or 90% of their trade inside the EU. A very, very different situation from the UK. So that was wrong. That there was less trade to lose from leaving the EU in the first place. And then, of course, having estimated a big impact of loss of trade, they then doubled that with the productivity assumptions. And when we looked at this productivity link, it seemed very odd. It was based on some rather old research, which itself was dominated by emerging economies. And that's fine. We can imagine that in emerging economies that there is a link. If an African economy reduces its trade barriers, lets American or other multinational companies in, then those multinational companies are doing a lot more trade. Excuse me, a lot more trade with the rest of the world, and their productivity goes up because you've now got multinationals in that economy. But little of this is relevant really to an advanced economy which has already got sophisticated trade links. And when we try to look at the link between growth of productivity and growth of trade among OECD members, including the UK, we found there was no relationship at all. The correlation coefficient for experts was essentially 0.0. But when we try to communicate with the Treasury and say, look, can we discuss these things? You know, there are obvious problems with this. They just flat refuse to talk to us at all. And then they then drop this gravity model that they've been using and then switch to something else. We can perhaps talk about the something else in a minute.
It's sort of the mirror image of the problem with the assessment of the costs. They've come up with completely implausible numbers for any potential benefits. So two things in particular. One is that they've suggested that the opportunity to lower trade barriers with the rest of the world will only be worth a few percentage points of economic growth over sort of 15 years. And equally, that the opportunity to set your own independent rules on your domestic economy, the sort of opportunity to deregulate and adopt smarter policies on things like state aid, that apparently is only worth a few tenths of a percentage point too. And again, that does seem completely implausible. For a start, almost every previous study of lowering of trade barriers when other countries have adopted free trade agreements has actually tended to show, bigger benefits than were originally expected. But also on the regulation side, it's not at all difficult to think of good examples of how the UK economy has been held back by the EU's over precautionary approach in loads of areas, areas like, for example, agriculture. Also, the EU seems to be extremely keen now on regulating some of the most productive areas of the economy, like financial services and the digital economy. So I think we would be unambiguously better off outside that framework. It doesn't necessarily mean that we won't have any regulations at all. It doesn't mean sort of slashing and burning those regulations that are useful and do protect consumers and animal welfare and so on. But the important thing is that we should be in a position to decide what those regulations should be. And they should be ones that suit our domestic economy, not those that are sort of a one size fits all for an EU of 27 or 28 very different member states.
And if I could just add to that, Ollie, the Treasury estimated a very small gain to UK GDP, the size of the UK economy, from having additional free trade agreements with countries outside the EU. I think from memory, that the figure was 0.2%, over 10 years. But the EU themselves estimate an impact 10 times higher than that from EU countries having those free trade agreements. And Australia has done some work on this, which again gets a much bigger figure from gains from free trade. So I'm afraid we're in a position where it's really hard to trust any Treasury estimate of impacts of trade either with the EU or outside the EU. And that's why I think Liz Truss at the Department of International Trade has set up this new committee to look at trade modelling and to look and see if the whole methodology of trade modelling can be improved, as the UK now moves into a situation where it's now negotiating serial trade agreements. Japan, biggest one recently, Canada just on the brink of being agreed, and so on.
Just to add to that point, a lot of the pessimistic modelling of no deal assumed that we wouldn't be able to replicate the trade deals that we have with third countries by virtue of our earlier membership of the European Union. And the IMF, for example, assumed it would take several years to replicate those trade deals, whereas in practice we've already replicated most of them. In some respects, the new replacement trade deals are actually a little bit better than the old ones. So that's one good example of the bias in these assumptions. Another thing that always annoys me is that often the default is that obviously we remain a member of the EU. Some people actually assume that as a member of the EU, we get additional benefits that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. So it's actually a very rosy view of the future development of the EU compared to the status quo. So it's not even simply keeping what we've got, but they assume that we're missing out on things that would be a lot better. Whereas anybody who's been watching what the EU has done over the last few years, it seems to be heading very much in the wrong direction. More centralization. If anything, a sort of increase in trade barriers to the rest of the world, more protectionism, more regulation. So I think even the status quo remaining in the EU would be nowhere near as attractive as those people coming up with pessimistic forecasts for no deal would suggest.
Shambles and embarrassment, I think, wouldn't be an understatement. Yeah, I mean, the Treasury famously predicted that there would be 4 quarters of recession. That's a whole year of recession, and an increase in unemployment of between 500,000 and 800,000. And the one thing they got right was a fall in the exchange rate, which did happen. There was something like a 15% fall in the sterling exchange rate. That helped trade and helped the economy. And indeed, we could argue that the sterling was overvalued before that, and that was a good thing. But that rise in unemployment, of course, didn't happen at all. In fact, right up until the COVID epidemic, there was a fall in unemployment of something like quarter of a million. So we could say that the Treasury was about 1 million out on the employment forecast over a period of 3 years. The reason they got it wrong was actually their prediction was an assumption. They had some modelling in there, but the key thing, it was all based on confidence, because this was a period in which the UK hadn't or wasn't going to actually leave the EU. We were talking about a period between the referendum and leaving. That the issue there was confidence. So the argument was that firms wouldn't have the confidence to invest and would lay off workers and the rest of it. So they had to make an assumption about confidence. I mean, we had nothing to go on. We'd never left the EU or done anything like this before, and so they just made a stab at it, and they thought the declining confidence would be something of the order of what happened during the banking collapse. Not quite as big as that, but a proportion of that. And then they use some statistical work to say, okay, well, if business confidence fell by that much, what would then happen to things like investment? That was a pure assumption. What they should have said in their reports, and what the Chancellor George Osborne should have said at the time, was, look, if confidence was to fall by this amount, then we think X and Y would happen. But they didn't say that. They tried to pass it off as a scientific prediction. George Osborne upped the ante immediately before the referendum by saying that he would need an emergency budget and taxes would increase, and there would be tsunamis. Sorry, I'm joking now, but that the world was going to fall apart if we had the temerity to vote for Brexit. Of course, we did vote for Brexit, and these terrible predictions didn't come to pass.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, there are perhaps 2 ways that the vote to leave has weakened the economy. I think both of them have been exaggerated by the unnecessarily prolonged process of exiting the EU. I think if we'd left a lot quicker, then any drag on growth wouldn't have been as big. One, as Graham mentioned, was the fall in the pound, which maybe in the short term it has pushed up inflation a little bit, but in the long run, it's more competitiveness for British exporters. I think that all comes out in the wash. And the second is the possible impact of Brexit uncertainty on investment. I mean, I think actually that is exaggerated a little bit, but in any event, it'll only be temporary. If you look at surveys of the long-term attractiveness of the UK as a destination for foreign investment, we're still at or near the top. There's one, for example, published recently by Ernst & Young making that point. And if we look at key sectors like financial services, it's true that a small number of jobs have been moved to other financial centres in Europe, but far less than many people anticipated. And that's essentially because a lot of the competitive strengths of the UK financial sector are essentially Brexit proof. And I think that's actually a very good example of how the EU probably needs us far more than we need them. So I think there are big sectors of the economy, whether that's financial services or future inward investment, that are essentially going to continue to thrive after Brexit. And indeed, once we do properly leave on almost any terms, then at least those people that might be adversely affected by Brexit will know what they have to deal with. And I think even in those sectors, confidence and investment will recover with the increased certainty. Well, just to say first, I thought that was a very clever piece of spin by the authors, because although the sort of detail of the document made clear they're talking about the potential long-term effects, I think most people, when they saw that headlines, thought, crikey, well, the UK economy has just collapsed by a quarter as a result of COVID, and millions of people are at risk of losing their jobs. And yet a no-deal Brexit could be even worse than that. So I think people would have reacted with horror to that headline, and I can understand why. But if you look at the substance of it, well, frankly, there wasn't a lot. From the start, nobody really knows what the longer term impact of COVID is going to be. But their calculations for the longer term impact of Brexit were as fundamentally flawed as all the other ones have been, for the reasons that we've been discussing. But on top of that, in particular, they measured a no-deal Brexit against a counterfactual or an alternative scenario that simply doesn't exist anymore, which is remaining within the EU. The reality is that we have already left the political union of the European Union. So the real choice is between no deal or whatever terms of a free trade agreement that the EU would be willing to offer and we're willing to accept. And I think in practical terms, the difference between those two scenarios, no deal or a fairly thin free trade agreement, the difference is actually pretty small. So to compare that to the shock from COVID, I think is highly, highly misleading. On top of that, that ignores all the other potential interactions between coronavirus and no deal, the several ways in which the pandemic could actually reduce the costs of leaving without a deal and actually increase some of the benefits. So on that basis, the comparison was flawed as well.
I think it's worth pointing out as well here that time and time again, we get these negative and exaggerated reports from academic economists, always in the same direction. It becomes, some of us refer to this now as a game of whack-a-mole. Every time we look at one of these reports, we go into them, we deconstruct them, and we find out why they're wrong. By the time we've done that, there've been another 3 published. And it becomes very hard to keep up. But we've concentrated earlier in this conversation on the Treasury, but the whole academic economics profession has got a case to answer this on this. It's now rather forgotten, but at the time of the referendum, a group popped up called Economists for Remain, which published rather similar short forecasts to the Treasury, except they were much vaguer. They just said things were going to be bad without putting much time scale on it or quantifying it. But the signatories to the letter from Economists for Remain included 10 Nobel Prize winners in economics, 70 professors of economics, and countless other academic economists. It was all right. It was too vague to say it was specifically wrong, but you know the whole implication of their predictions was wrong, and we've heard nothing from them again. You know, no apology, no follow up, no nothing. So this is a pretty arrogant profession now, I think. I mean, it used to be my profession, but what Brexit has shown is that most academic economists, like most academics, at least in the humanities and social sciences, are ideological remainers. And their work has reflected that. Yeah, and this is a very unsatisfactory position for society, you know, who's funding the universities. If research tends to follow ideology, we really don't know where we are. And something of the same issues of, well, perhaps a rather different sort, but at least issues of confidence have come up over the predictions of COVID as well. It's time, I think, that we had a real investigation or a real public inquiry into what's going wrong here. And looking at the interface between ideological and political views on the one hand and the scientific research on the other.
Well, I think that's a good example of some pretty shaky work. It almost seems to be done on the back of an envelope, and I think there are basically two problems with it. First of all, the initial estimates for the cost of doing business and the additional customs procedures was simply far too high. It assumed basically that people wouldn't adapt behavior whatsoever. They wouldn't, for example, combine different shipments together to make savings on the customs costs, or that they wouldn't, for example, adopt alternative technologies or anything like that to get those costs down. Certainly, if you talk to most people in the business world, I mean, people like John Mills, for example, who run big import-export businesses, they were completely bemused by the numbers that were being presented. The second problem, and this is a general problem with all of the long-term modelling that people have done, is they simply extrapolate forward whatever the hypothetical costs might be now, and assume that nothing changes in future, so that there's no changes in trade patterns, or there's no improvements in technology. I mean, we know from almost every other aspect of our lives that everything is becoming, cheaper and simpler over time. So even if there is an increase in customs costs initially when we introduce the new arrangements from early next year, it would be wrong to extrapolate those into the future, because people would adapt, work smarter, and work cheaper. So I think that whole approach was fundamentally flawed, but you can see why it was done. It was done to come up with a big, scary number. Anything in the tens or the 20s of billions is going to get you headlines. But if you dig a little bit deeper, then those numbers fall apart. And indeed, I think actually HMRC has actually rode back on some of those numbers and admitted that the original ones were not accurate. But needless to say, those retractions have not got anywhere near as much publicity as the original scare stories.
Yeah, it was interesting. The original 20 billion figure that got very wide publicity, we immediately knew that was hugely inflated, and quickly worked out that it in fact covered foreign costs. It covered importers' costs as well as exporters' costs. So it was the cost to the EU as well as the UK. It was publicised as a UK figure. The original figure was announced at a Treasury Select Committee inquiry, and Mr. Thompson, the head of HMRC, was then called back. I think the following week, we published and said, look, this was double counting, and he was called back to the Treasury Select Committee, and he made the correction, and he was allowed to do so just quickly in one sentence with no follow-up from the committee. So it got into the records, but it was never received any publicity. And I think that was deliberate. The Treasury Select Committee didn't, or at least the chair of the Select Committee, Nicky Morgan, didn't want to play up that sort of issue. and this is the way it's gone again and again and again. So in the end, we always had to say thank goodness for elections, because it always seemed as if Brexit was terrible in the media until we had the next election, and then suddenly it found that the British people were behind it, even if the media and the civil service and the academia weren't. Well, sorry, if I might just come in first there. The Lord Ashcroft did a poll, a poll immediately after exit poll, I think, or polling at least immediately after the referendum, and he found of people that voted Remain, the great majority were concerned about the economic impact. He said they voted Remain because they believe they've been told that there would be a big negative impact. So it seems obvious that the reports done by the Treasury, the Bank of England, the OECD, IMF, quite a few economic consultants as well, had this effect of making the majority for Brexit smaller than it otherwise would have been. I remember there was 1 week, a few weeks before the referendum, when a number of these reports were all published in 1 week, IMF, OECD, and so on. And I remember my wife turning to me and said, "Look, Brexit can't now win." With the whole weight of the business world against you, it looks like a loss. And the reason that didn't happen, I think, was that the great British public, or a large part of it, just didn't believe these forecasts. And this is a rather dreadful thing. I mean, it's a damaging thing well beyond Brexit. I think that experts are now not believed. We have a bit of a problem with COVID. We have something of a problem with global warming and other things. It's terribly important that academic experts and scientists are responsible about these things, and as I was saying before, don't use their own academic prestige to essentially support their own political prejudices.
Yeah. Well, just to add 2 points to that, I still think we're paying a price for the prolonged project fear from economists in two ways. I mean, first of all, it's I think is continuing to undermine consumer and business confidence. So people, I think, are far more worried than they really should be about the impact of Brexit and in particular leaving without a deal. But also, I think it's weakening the position of the UK government. I mean, you occasionally hear, for example, that Boris Johnson or somebody else is rattled by the latest warnings from the Remain supporting economists that different forms of Brexit would be a complete disaster. And it is, of course, vitally important in any negotiation that you should be willing to walk away if the deal on offer is not a good one. But if the government is managing to be convinced that we must accept any deal that the EU is willing to offer in order to avoid the disaster that would be no deal, then obviously we end up with a far worse deal than we'd otherwise get. So I think that's the sort of the biggest concern I have at the moment. That a government that's on the back foot for all sorts of other reasons, whether it's the handling of COVID or the economy, whatever else it might be, might feel that it can't risk leaving the EU fully without a deal. Whereas, in fact, in the longer term, that may well be the best thing to do, particularly if the alternative is a deal that locks us into a lot of the costs of de facto membership of the EU without having the full opportunities to exploit the benefits of independent free trade and independence on regulation and tax and everything else.
Yeah, perhaps I could just add to that. I mean, Julian may well be right about this, but one interesting aspect is that the present government itself no longer believes these forecasts, and I know that from to number 11, Patrick Minford, and one or two of his colleagues went. We talked to Sajid Javid when he was Chancellor. Rushi was in the current Chancellor was in the room at the same time. And they said to us that the Treasury would not be allowed to produce any more reports of this sort. They were damaging and unhelpful. And that's exactly what's happened. I mean, the media has been pressing the government to produce more reports, on each of their proposals on Brexit, and the government has just said no. And I think it seems fairly obvious as well that David Frost, the lead negotiator, isn't taking much notice of these reports. So I'm fairly hopeful that that's not part of the equation here. But what is important and worth saying is that the EU themselves seem to firmly believe, or at least keep saying, that the impact of Brexit will be much more negative on the UK than it will on themselves. I always find it slightly comical. It's as if they've got our future at heart. They keep telling us, no, this will damage you. You can't go for no deal. But it may well be, and it would certainly be realistic or reasonable to think that, given the reports by the Treasury and all the international economics bodies to the UK, that the EU finds this easy to believe. So that they may be quite honest in a way. I mean, it may be a genuine belief on their behalf that a no-deal Brexit will damage the UK economy. But they certainly use that belief very strongly to keep hammering away at David Frost and telling him that he will damage the UK if he goes through with this. But as far as we can see, and as far as we know privately as well, David Frost isn't taking much notice of that. So I'm still hopeful that, as Julian says, we now have a proper bottom line here. The UK is willing to walk away. I personally hope that will lead to a good agreement on both sides that's beneficial to both the UK and the EU. But it's perfectly obvious that without that bottom line, that just wouldn't happen.